the Leash Tech Foundation, and our partner organization, Impact Cubed. We have a strong presence in Israel. We have a team on the ground. We've been working on grassroots, bottom-up social change for the last decade. And kind of in the early hours, even following the massacre on October the 7th, we noticed a stunning kind of response coming from volunteers and from just people that sprang into action amidst these shocking and crisis events, many of them in our networks. It was a story that we felt was going to gain momentum and something that was quite unique. And so in the early hours as we were in touch with all the people we were worried about on the ground and the people that we know have their fingers on the pulse of what community needs, at that time, we formed a grassroots response initiative, which some of you have been part of, and we really appreciate it, to really put flexible funds in the hands of leaders that are on the ground. I've also just returned and so each week we're sending out information about priorities, and we were suggested, and we're really happy to do this, to do a weekly Zoom. This is going to be every week while it makes sense, usually on Thursdays at 10. For 30 to 45 minutes to really give you a feel of what's going on the ground in Israel in this moment. According to the field, according to the people who are sort of closest to the field. Most of these, we will have guests from civil society, some of the people that are involved with issues of the week or the day. Today, it's going to be me sharing a briefing. I've actually just come back yesterday from about 3 weeks in Israel. I'm going back a week from Sunday in just over a week. And so I feel like I've kind of gotten a sense of what's going on the ground there, and we'll be happy to share a briefing with you today. And I want to just encourage you to, if you have questions, please put them in the chat or put them in the Q&A. I'll do my best to address them, if not on this briefing, which will be 30 minutes, then in a follow-up. So first, I wanted to just lay out the basic facts. I know that some of us have different levels of knowledge. So at least 1,400 people have been murdered on October the 7th, and during the days after that. There's still projected to be about 150 to 200 missing people, which means that there's about 200 funerals that haven't taken place yet. Most probably, those are people that were murdered, but they are awaiting identification of the remains, which I'm going to talk about a little bit. It's been a very arduous process. Here we are, almost 4 weeks after the events of Saturday, October 7th, and the torture and it was so brutal that it's taking a long time. I don't want to get too graphic about it. There are 210,000 evacuees, internal evacuees and internal refugees, people that are displaced internally and counting from the south and from the north of the country. Many went to Eilat, which is now close to tripling its population of 60,000 to now 150,000 or so. Or they went to the Dead Sea, and many went to Jerusalem. There's about at least 50,000 in Jerusalem, and I'm using round numbers because it's catching up. We really don't know precise numbers, and many of these volunteer efforts are engaged in mapping that. But there hasn't, things happen so quickly that there hasn't been a lot of precision in numbers. And frankly, this is a story, this internal refugee, these refugees is a story that we don't really see being reported much, where we know that other refugee crises are being reported internationally. And if a northern front opens or expands, there's going to be many, many more evacuees and refugees for the north. It's one of the things that some of the efforts are trying to plan around, but it's really impossible to plan around. So that's a big unknown right now. How is the rest of Israel going to take in all of these internal refugees when it may be many, many months until they are able to return to their homes or permanently housed. That's an open question, and I'll get into that. There's, according to the IDF, from what I saw this morning, 241 hostages. They've been held captive now for 4 weeks. It does not include the 4 released prisoners or the 1 rescued IDF soldier, 241 without those. There's at least 150,000 people and probably many more that are unemployed. And 360,000 soldiers who have been called up for service. As of this morning, 25 of those have died, mostly in the ground operation that happened in the last week. I think actually all of them in the last week. So there's many issues, and I just want to say that there's a rippling effect of need. There's those who died in their families, there's the hostages in their families, there's the evacuees, there's the reservist families, all these, suddenly single parent families of the 360,000 that have been called up. There are the first responders, and then everybody else. I mean, this is a nation in trauma, and that's very, very clear. One of the bright spots, I mean, if you can call it that I mentioned earlier, is this springing into action of the grassroots and of volunteers who were frustrated, I think, with feeling powerless and just really started to get a move on. This ranges from individuals that went down to rescue people and to save people, just got in their cars down to the south on October the 7th and did indeed do that. And many volunteers who started to reach out. So I thought to break down kind of the organization of this civilian response. That's one aspect. I'm going to talk a little bit about trust and the trust deficits right now in Israel, as well as what the government has done so far. I'll address the food and farming crisis in particular, and then kind of close with a few brighter spots. So the organization of the civilian response, as you can imagine, it's been quite chaotic there. But one of the major elements that's quite interesting is that there are several major and scores of smaller hamals. And a hamal is actually an acronym for basically a war room, if you would translate it directly from the Hebrew. But there are these civilian situation rooms and operation centers that really sprouted up in the first day of the attack as volunteers gathered to organize immediate rescue and response. Hundreds showing up to help. And now a few weeks later, these civilian operations centers are very much going strong. They're starting to look at the next phase, especially the major ones in the major cities. And the key areas that civilian volunteers should continue to be involved in, the balance between philanthropy and government, and when is it a disincentive? We don't, now it's filling a void, but how much longer can this really go on? How much longer can the response be on the shoulders of these volunteers? I think that's a question very much. I started to hear a lot more this week than I had heard before. And of course, I think related to that is the volunteers, some burnout and fatigue, financial struggles, as many have lost their jobs, and the plan, which we don't really know, to passing off to local and national government entities that really have no capacity to take on some of these loads. So to give a sense of these hamals, besides being located in each city, they're really located in almost every, I would say, village or town, at least in some form or fashion. There's also at least 4 Haredi, ultra-Orthodox hamals, situation operations centers, an Arab Jewish situation room, civilian operations center that is actually being operated to serve the Bedouin community, which has been disproportionately impacted. A civilian operations center for people with disabilities, at least one of those. There's one in East Jerusalem. So it's actually a really interesting social phenomenon that has developed. I wanted to give you a case study, just a little bit of an in-depth into the Jerusalem Hamal. So that was set up in the multi-story Nissan Nativ acting school on October 7th, which is right in the center of the city. It's in it's a brand new building in a new arts complex. There were about 2,000 volunteers per day in the early days. Now there's still about 1,000 volunteers per day. I was told just a few days ago that at least half of those volunteers have lost their jobs since October the 7th. Besides multiple floors of various volunteer teams, and there's a supply and distribution warehouse on one of the floors. On the ground floor is a beautifully designed shop, which was a shop without prices, but it was actually set up by students at Bitzalel Art School. And there are clothes and all kinds of accessories and supplies from donated items that are both new and gently used, and it's really, really beautifully arranged. And busloads of evacuees and others are showing up there every day at that shop, which is operating, I think, 12 to 14 hours a day. The Jerusalem Civilian Operations Center is run by a partnership of multiple Jerusalem-based organizations, everything from the major entity that was organizing the Jerusalem protests and then pivoted to responding to this need, to one of the political parties and movements, to an international aid volunteer organization called Lev Echad that was actually working a lot in Ukraine, sending Israeli volunteers and others to Ukraine to serve communities around there, and now is very, very present in the volunteer management at the Jerusalem Hamal. To give you, these are organizations that would probably had just a few weeks ago major turf issues. But now they really are, I have to say, really operating as one and with singular focus. There's to give you a sense, there's sort of a operating council or a very smaller management team. And they've divided, just to give you a sense of one Hamal, into 18 and counting teams. And so these are the teams. I thought I would just put some more color on them. There's the call center and information and referral that's staffed by volunteers 18 hours a day. They're getting calls all the time from people that need help with something, who have been impacted by the disaster, especially the displaced, but also reservist families and others. There's a team of rabbis and spiritual leaders. There's a team of that are devoted to transportation and driving. There's a team devoted to hot food preparation. There's a team that is putting together the warehouses. There's a few of these teams. One is the needs by civilians, which is the clothes, dry goods, diapers, a team working on that. A team working on sourcing equipment that the military needs. There were shortages, of course, as you know, this erupted quickly. A team that's devoted to sourcing medical supplies and medical equipment from all over, has been mostly for the South, but now they're starting to plan for the North also. There's a team focused on data management and reporting, a team focused on social media, a team that's just devoted to purchasing, a team that's devoted to philanthropy and raising money, a team that is working with the hotels. There are 60 hotels that the evacuees in Jerusalem have been placed at. About 46 of them are currently being served by the Civilian Operations Center, which means that this team is sort of dealing with everything from placing them at the hotels, to hotel relations, to having actually a coordinator at 46 of the 60, an education coordinator at 46 of the 60, and most of those include pop-up schools and a coordinator for other kinds of activities, because you have volunteers that want to do all kinds of things, from show movies to manicurists to everything. So that's, it's a very, very kind of a professional volunteer operation. There's a childcare team. There's a team that takes care of the shop, the team that focuses on education, as I mentioned, a team that's focusing on housing and hosting in the neighborhoods, evacuees, the evacuees that are in the neighborhoods, which I'll talk to about in a minute, a team that's focused about in on checking in family to family, and a team that's focused on trauma and psychotherapy. It's another kind of trauma line that's fully staffed. It's a fully staffed hotline by psychologists and social workers and trained volunteers, all Jerusalem based, who are volunteering their time and kind of doing like first response, first aid, emergency trauma by phone. As I mentioned, there are 60 hotels, and that with coordinators, at least 46 hotels, and they're adding now to sort of have the Hamal, have volunteer teams at each of the hotels. They're trying to work closely with the municipality, which actually, on a municipal level, has very good intentions and some good staff, but little capacity, and have just been totally overwhelmed. So that's kind of a balance that's ongoing. Now, a particular need lies within the neighborhoods. Jerusalem actually is a city of neighborhoods. It has about 47 or 48 neighborhoods, each with its own community council and community center. A big need is neighborhood-based outreach through the community centers for these like invisible evacuees, they're calling them. There's probably at least 20,000 of them in the neighborhoods. The rest are in the hotels. And there's pop-ups of services. I was talking to some of the community center leaders the other day, and the key needs they're hearing about in their neighborhoods are food, which is really the first layer of a greater financial crisis, expanding or need to expand existing services like kids activities, even exercise, things like that the community centers are, needing to ramp up very, very quickly. As well as emotional support and additional social workers. And then there are also some related needs in the neighborhoods for the families of reservists that we're paying quick attention to. Other important entities in the civilian response sort of organization, in this civilian response beyond the Hamas, there's the Forum for the Hostages, the Forum for Hostage Families. This is 1,500 volunteers that have come together from like business, media, law, every aspect to support the families in every way possible, but also to raise international awareness and to put pressure where pressure can be put on governments, on their own government, as well as governments that might be able to be influential, and on the world population, not to forget about that we have 242, I read this morning, hostages that are still awaiting justice. They're still in captivity. Earlier in the week, I visited what I think is the saddest place in Israel right now, and there's so much sadness right now in Israel, and it is the tent that has been set up outside the Kiryah, which is like the Pentagon in Israel, by the hostage families. There's a presence by the hostage families and others, but the families are always there 24/7. Pictures and of each of the hostages, a little bit about their stories, and the reason that they're there is, of course, to raise awareness, and there was media there, but also to share with the officials inside no ceasefire until our hostages are out, and to keep that top of mind for the government. It's an it was an extremely powerful and moving experience for me, and I think for anybody that is there, and really, really hits home the toll of this war that is just being taken so, I want to say disproportionately, but in just such a minute by minute, every second way by the families of the hostages. That's another entity in this civilian response machine. There's volunteer efforts that are around the identification of the deceased, like I mentioned to you. Again, I don't want to go into such graphic detail, but there's a whole team of like radiologists and medical volunteers that have experience with identification, dentists of dental, remains, and also bones, etc. There's I met actually an archaeologist that is working on this with a whole team from archaeology, which has like pivoted some of their methods that they used to learn more about events of thousands of years ago to identifying now. And there's also the volunteer first responders, the medics that came, and then the people that I was talking about before who are working on identification of the deceased, the people that came to rescue people. I think these are going to be trauma needs that are going to be needed sooner rather than later. In fact, our initiative has already made a grant to a couple of these first aid initiatives. There's civilian safety patrols in certain neighborhoods. In many neighborhoods, as you can imagine, the feeling of safety has really been shaken. And one other element that I just want to be sure to mention about this civilian operations organization is that young adults and teenagers have really taken on enormous roles in this, enormous roles. I was actually at a Shabbat last week with some teenagers were there, and I was talking to them, and I didn't fully realize how much they've taken on. Everything from childcare to driving supplies around to volunteering to work in farms and fields to harvest what can be salvaged and more. They're even involved in some of these civilian protection units to extents that, it was pretty amazing for teenagers. It's an outsized role, and I think this is going to need to be addressed because, many things, because this can't go on much longer. They're taking too much of an outsized role, but it is very important to know about and witness now for anybody that's like worried about the next generation. So that's a breakdown of some of the volunteer organization. I wanted to talk a little bit, and we're already, I'll try to go through this quickly, but about the trust and the trust deficit. So there's a huge trust deficit right now in the government, especially I think it's from fear stemming from a total breakdown of the social contract and expectations of the state around security, but now also around the economic recovery and the lack of any kind of plan for an economic recovery. There was a recent survey of the Jewish public that showed that 70% plus have no trust or very little trust in the prime minister. And even among coalition supporters and voters, almost half don't trust him. There's a growing call that just has been in the last few days. When I first arrived in Israel, I think there was anger at the government, but sort of a clear agreement that we need to deal with this after the war. First, we have a war to win. I really noticed a change in the last week of people that saying, it's time for them to step down. We can't, even now that we're fighting a war, they are MIA, they are not there for the hostages, they're not there for us and the evacuees and all the people, they need to step down. I think conversely, there seems to be, the survey showed, and also I found that a real trust in the IDF and in civil society and these grassroots groups. So 96%, this survey found, of Israelis trust the grassroots volunteer organizations that have sprung up to pitch in. And I should say that I have never seen 96% of Israelis agree on anything, even did the sun rise that morning. So this is quite a remarkable level of trust. And the IDF too, as I said, even with the terrible failures along the southern border, 3/4 of Jewish Israelis trust the commanders in the IDF, and 98% trust just sort of the regular soldiers in the IDF. I guess mostly because it's people's sons, daughters, spouses, brothers, sisters. It's quite remarkable. The same survey showed that 82% of Israelis now think that Israeli society is quite or very united. And when a similar question was asked before October 7th, it was less than a third. So I want to mention that all these findings were very much borne out also in my own personal interactions. And I want to mention that with regard to morale, I actually found, and anecdotally, that the morale among the IDF, like so soldiers who are on our team in Jerusalem and the friends and children of friends who are deployed with whom I spoke, is actually extremely high, even as the morale of the civilians is pretty low. It might change, and it probably will as the toll of war becomes higher. And just this week, we witnessed that toll just 1 week after the start of ground operations. But it is interesting, and I think that all this is going to indicate like a very interesting opportunity for the after, whatever the after is, that Israelis are empowered and they're kind of taking back their own role in shaping their future, and with a total lack of trust in the government. There's an opportunity here for these grassroots volunteers and others to really like step up into leadership roles that I think we're very much interested in continuing to support. So follow those stories. I want to just quickly talk about the government's role. I've talked a little bit about the capacity issues, the importance of passing off these volunteer efforts, especially to the local municipalities, also to national, and what that's going to look like. That's going to be a key focus in the next month or two. As volunteers are, getting burnt out or looking for work, that's just going to really, really be important. I mean, at this point, in terms of my advice to funders up until now, I've been violating like all the philanthropy advice that I usually give, which is to say like, we can't worry too much about duplication. We've got to give to those, like give to everything right now. The magnitude of need is huge. Like basically nothing that you give is going to be a mistake. And that continues to be true. The magnitude of need is profound. And at a certain point, we're not at that point yet, but I think like in a month or in the next few, at some point, we're going to have to look more carefully on what is this enabling government not to do. So more on that soon. I do want to mention that there was one breakthrough this week that was a positive announcement by the government, that the Ministry of Finance has recommended to the larger cabinet that the policy on furlough, halat, that people get, that kind of was in place during COVID. When people are laid off, they get a certain amount right away from the government. They're proposing to actually like loosen some of the restrictiveness around COVID and really immediately deploy that, so that small businesses that have been affected, consultants that have been affected, people working 9-to-5 jobs in industries like tourism that have been decimated will be eligible for government stipends through this halat program, through the National Insurance Institute. It hasn't been actualized or instituted yet, but that's the one thing government did do this week that I think is a very good trend. Quickly, I'll mention that I want to just talk about food and farming a little bit. This is actually going to be the subject of our next briefing on Thursday. I'm going to have a couple guests involved in this area, but it's important for you to know, because I don't think it's been as covered, that there are 3 crises that are converging right now, and food has come up in my conversations this week more than I ever have heard before. Number one of those 3 crises is that more than half of the farms are in the South, and so much of which they're just not accessible. Also, much of farm labor in Israel has been Thai workers, mostly from Thailand, foreign workers, and Palestinian workers, neither of which are working much. The Palestinian workers really aren't. And the Thai workers have mostly gone home. I mean, many people from Thailand were actually killed on October the 7th or have been abducted. The second crisis converging is that thousands of people have lost their jobs. Food prices and all prices are very high right now in Israel. They were before, they're even higher now. And so they're struggling to make ends meet and they need food. And the third is the growing needs of the vulnerable populations that were present already have now been added to by the needs of the evacuees around food, members of the IDF around food, and others. And so this is something that really we're paying a lot of attention to, and we're going to focus on in our briefing next week. So I want to also say that in our next, other upcoming needs that we're seeing is trauma is going to be a huge need, both, of course, psychological trauma, but also, physical trauma. Rehab, we were starting to talk about and map some of the rehab hospitals and needs. There's going to be a big, big need for that. We're already seeing it. First responder trauma, as I mentioned, trauma or psychological support for leaders and volunteers, stipends for volunteers, support for volunteers. It's going to be really important to keep these efforts going and underway. And the first responders. I want to, before I wrap it, I want to talk about 5 bright spots to kind of leave you with. First is the volunteers. Well over half the Israeli public is volunteering, and the self-empowerment and sort of the taking back of their control of their own future that is clear is really going to have profound effects, I think. Second has to do with the ultra-Orthodox community, how the ultra-Orthodox community has immediately become engaged, thousands of them. They're seeing the IDF differently. Many of them are engaged in delivering food, in driving, in all kinds of different generally because they're not part of the IDF, in civilian roles to support the IDF they're involved with, and actually enlistment in the IDF by the ultra-Orthodox, and especially in the kind of quick courses, like quick training programs that take the core skills of the ultra-Orthodox in, Talmud study that kind of leads very well into skills like coding and skills, especially that the intelligence units need, have gone through the roof. There's a program that we've been involved with that was recruiting like 150 of some of the best and brightest students in Talmud. Until now, they just emailed me actually and said they have 2,000 Haredim in the last few weeks that have enrolled in this course. They have to figure out how to serve them. And that's kind of a course that is a quick study for 6 months and then goes to some kind of a supportive role in the intelligence units, which is actually much needed. So that's an interesting trend and bright spot to pay attention to. I think third, it's really important for you to know that even amidst this low morale and grief and trauma, the resilience of the Israeli public is amazing, just even in the ways that they're trying to get back into routine. Organizing simchas, bar mitzvahs for evacuee families. So many people are baking cakes and wedding cakes and, trying to make opportunities and space for joy. Also, a lot of weddings have taken place in the last couple of weeks, especially among soldiers that have been deployed. And one interesting, example of that is that there's a show, there's a TV show called Eretz Nehederet, which kind of translates to This Wonderful Place. It's a satiric show. It's kind of like Israel's Saturday Night Live. It's been on the air for 22 years, and they came back to the air last week, 19 days later. Coincidentally, Saturday Night Live came back 19 days after 9/11. They came back to the air, and I guess it wasn't planned. And there's actually a hilarious segment that will circulate that they did in English, kind of satirical to the BBC's treatment and bias to the war. But it says a lot to the resilience of Israeli society that the show is back on the air. And I will say there's a corollary to that. Timing is everything, and they actually are not releasing a show this week in the wake of they were supposed to record it on Wednesday, and Wednesday was a particularly brutal day in terms of loss of IDF soldiers, so there won't be a show this week. So it's sort of this push-pull, but it is an interesting story being told. A fourth, really incredible bright spot is that the babies being born now, I don't know if this is a bright spot, but just a testament to the cycle of life. Many, many more babies are being named Be'eri, are being named Nir, are being named Oz, and are being named for the kibbutzim and for the places that burnt on October the 7th. Just one small example, a family that I met at the Hamal this week. The woman was from Netivot, a very poor area. The family's from Netivot. They were evacuated. They were in the hotels. She's 37. She was 37 weeks pregnant when they were evacuated. She was very, very nervous. It was very complicated for them to leave. They were worried about losing the baby. It came after many years of wanting a baby. And I spoke to them, and they had their little newborn in their arms, and they named him Be'eri. So for kibbutz Be'eri that really was destroyed. And fifth is just the uplifting of so many heroic deeds and actions that these stories, I think, are being circulated intentionally among all the stories that are circulating of loss, brutality, grief. There's a real intentional effort, I think, among many to circulate stories of the heroic deeds, of the actions that, so that we can kind of begin the path of restoring the public's faith and all of our faith, really, in humanity amidst this great disaster. So we're out of time. We're probably a little bit over time. Before we wrap, I want to just thank you all and invite you to follow up with questions, any feedback on this. I would love, because I can't see you all, so I'm not sure, how you're reacting. If this was good information, if you want information about other things, we are going to be sending out some follow-ups. We have a regular communication that goes out about our initiative every 10 to 14 days. We're also organizing. Please stay tuned for more information. We're organizing along with a few partner organizations for Tuesday night from 7 to 8, a virtual community gathering a month after the hostages were taken, November 7th, to keep them at the forefront. This is the most important thing we can be doing right now. Keep them in our conversation. It's also one of the most important mitzvot, commandments in Judaism, redemption of the captives. So please participate in that, and we'll be sending you information about that. Thank you again very much for being part of this, and Shabbat Shalom, and wishing us all just better days and more happier days for our people. Thank you.